Today I'm going to compare two games, Scythe and Root. And my goal is, by the end of this video, whether or not you've even heard of these games, you'll know which game appeals more to you. The way I'm going to do this is by comparing 5 attributes: theme, mechanics, luck, strategy, and complexity. I call that breakdown the perfect board game formula, and if you'd like to learn more about it, you can check out information at theperfectboardgame.com, or you can buy this t-shirt, which is carefully hand-drawn and features more than 100 board game components. Cards on the table, between these two games, my personal preference is Root. However, it's not my goal to convince you that Root is a superior game, so I'm going to be sure to list the strengths of both games, and I'll even try to be a little more generous with Scythe to compensate for my bias. So first, what are these games about? Scythe takes place in Eastern Europe in an alternate timeline after World War I, when the different nations are competing for dominance of the region by amassing the greatest fortune. They do this by increasing with popularity among the locals and building resources and dominating different areas of the board in order to make money. The game ends when one player has achieved 6 victory conditions. Now let's talk about Root. Root is also a game about competing factions and area control. In fact, the subtitle of the game is A Game of Woodland Might and Right. Players are competing for the first to gain 30 victory points, or the first to complete the victory conditions on a dominance card. But how that theme is embodied in the gameplay is very different from how the theme is embodied in Scythe, as we're about to find out as we talk about mechanics. For Scythe, playing Scythe feels much like a puzzle, because every player has a player mat, which is different, and a faction, which has a unique ability and a position on a board, which is symmetrical in shape, but not symmetrical in the availability of resources. So from the onset, every player must consider their combination and try to optimize how they're going to use their faction's abilities and the limitations on their player mat. They also have an ability during the game to upgrade the player mat and make certain actions cheaper in order to provide for this engine that produces resources and helps them move across the board. For each individual player in Scythe, a character will emerge out of the combination of how they play their strategy with their faction and their player mat. This is the defining characteristic of Scythe's mechanics. However, it does have a few other things that are worth mentioning. Most notable is how the game handles resources. In a lot of other games, resources stay by the player, but in Scythe, the resources stay on the board. And who has access to the resources depends on your presence on the board. If an opponent invades you and you lose in battle, your pieces will retreat to your home base, and that player will assume control over the region and all of the resources you left behind. This means that defending your regions is of critical importance. But when it comes to conflict in the game, this is where I personally have the greatest issue, because conflict in Scythe is not very common compared to other games that are similar with area control. Simply winning 2 conflicts is enough to gain a star, which is one of the victory conditions. And really, in a game of Scythe, the number of conflicts can be between 2 or 6, I guess even more than that, depending on the players and the way they strategize. But conflict is rare. Conflict is very simple in Scythe. Each player reveals a card, and then the high card, along with the reinforcements, wins the battle, and the loser has to retreat. But because the retreating player loses resources, it can really, really hurt to lose. And then because conflict is so rare, there aren't very many chances to make a comeback from there. Now, the great response to that is, well, then don't lose conflict, or reinforce your position so that people don't invade. And that's an excellent response to my complaint. Nevertheless, I get kind of frustrated by it. So how do I rate that for mechanics? Well, usually I give a very high rating when a game seriously impresses me with something that's ingenious or innovative. In this case, nothing about Scythe is especially innovative, although I do really like how the different factions in the player mats lends itself to excellent replayability. That's not brilliance in mechanics, though. That's a replayability factor. I think that it gets some credit, but mostly the game is pretty average, about a 6 for mechanics. Now let's compare that to Root. In Root, each faction has a completely different set of rules, so it's very hard to describe the mechanics for the entire game. What I can do is I can sort of briefly describe the things that are generally in common, although, again, every faction has its exceptions. So it's a board where you're moving around following roads. Unlike Scythe, when you land in a space where an opponent is present, you don't have to have a conflict with them. Conflict is optional. When conflict is resolved, dice are rolled, and the value of your dice is limited by the number of warriors you have in the space. And players use cards to craft them in order to gain points, or to play them in order to do some types of movements, or do some of the other types of faction actions. So there's a lot of card play, there's some dice rolling, it's area control again, there is some building construction for some of the players like that. But if you'll notice, what I'm not saying is anything that's very unheard of. This is all very common elements. Again, I think the game is pretty average in its mechanics, but in Root's case, where the brilliance comes in is the fact that every single player has a very different set of rules. That means that the game is more complicated because you can't just learn how to play yourself. You have to learn how other players are playing as well. You have to really pay attention. And the speed at which players can accrue victory points is much faster at a certain point. It isn't uncommon. Out of 30 possible victory points, it's not uncommon for a player to win by 10 victory points or even more than that. So it's important that players pay attention to what other players are doing in order to sort of form alliances and prevent them from shooting up ahead. I really like that that level of attention is required in this game, and I really think it's admirable that a game with so much difference can still be balanced. Although, if I want to be fair and list a complaint about that, I do think that some players will be frustrated by the requirement to have to understand what other players are doing, and the fact that another player can jump ahead so quickly. That might actually turn some players off. I really like how it requires me to pay attention to the game. But if I'm going to grade these two games on the same standards, then again, for mechanics, I'm going to give it about a 6. Now that brings us to theme. So for Scythe, I have to note that with Scythe, the game is exceptional in its components and artwork. I think this world of post-World War I alternate history timeline with mechs and the stylization of all these characters really encourages players' imaginations. In fact, the encounter cards that you pick up during the course of the game, they don't even have flavor text. They just have pictures, which in the rulebook even, it encourages you to sort of fill in the blanks for what could be happening in that graphic. I think it does an exceptional job of creating a story through the artwork. But when I rate theme, it's not the components that influences and creates a high rating. What creates a high rating is whether or not the gameplay supports the theme. And it feels too much like a puzzle to me to say that the game feels very thematic in its gameplay, if I want to be clear. For theme, I would say the game has a 4. When I compare Root, earlier this year I did a review of Root and I rated it on the theme of animals and woodlands, and I gave it a 4 also because the theme is very painted on, and it's true. There's nothing about this game that feels like you're a cat or you're a bird, but that's not really what the game is about. The game is not about what the animals are. The game is about the roles of the characters. It feels kind of like Peter Pan or Robin Hood or something like that. And the Marquis de Cat is the Sheriff of Nottingham, and the Vagabond is Robin Hood, and then the Woodland Alliance is like the poor people, something like kind of like that. Each player has a very different role, and rather than trying to figure it out by optimizing the costs of different actions, the characters are very well defined in the rules for each faction. So the gameplay of Root feels extremely thematic. Now, there are a few very minor criticisms, but I could suffice to say that when I give a 9 or a 10, it's only because I'm really wowed by the theme. Root is not extraordinary in that sense, but for theme, I would say it has an 8. When it comes to luck, I think both games are extremely comparable. Scythe has cards, which you draw, so that's luck involved. When you play Root, you're rolling dice. That's luck involved. However, both games have lots of ways to mitigate for bad luck and lots of strategy surrounding the luck. They're certainly not games that are focused on luck, but it does really have an influence on the outcome of the game. So for luck, I give both games a 4. For strategy, the strategy is very different in both games. In Scythe, I've made it very clear, the game is all about optimization of your faction and your player map. For strategy, and not to mention paying attention to what other players are doing and preparing defenses in case they invade and take all of your resources. I really like that. It feels very strategic. I would give it a 9. For Root, there's so much going on. Again, player-to-player interaction as you're observing what other players are doing, trying to prevent them and trying to achieve dominance yourself. So it feels very strategic. Again, a 9. And then for complexity, you can just look at the length of the rule books. Root has 2 rule books. Scythe has 1. Scythe, every player is mostly playing by the same set of rules. In Root, every player is playing by a different set of rules. For Scythe, complexity is a 5. For Root, complexity is an 8. Now, in summary, which of these 2 games would you rather play? The big difference here is complexity and theme, at least the way that I rate theme. If you can handle a more complex game, I think you would definitely be interested in Root. If you prefer theme that's embodied in the gameplay, you would prefer Root. But if you prefer theme in the components and the artwork, you would prefer Scythe. If you like and you're engaged by a puzzle, you would prefer Scythe. This is my take on these 2 board games. My preference is in the theme and the gameplay and the factions ability in Root, but I definitely recognize some of the strengths in Scythe. If you like this video, if you like the way I describe and the way I prefer these games, stick around by subscribing so you can hear more of my recommendations. Don't forget to go to theperfectboardgame.com. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.